could just dance. Okay, look, welcome everybody. My name's Richard Dennis. I'm the director of the Australia Institute, and we like to host politics in the pub. There's a few familiar faces here and a few unfamiliar faces, which is even better. So thank you very much for coming along to hear Brian Howe tonight, who I'll introduce. Thanks. I always like it when I turn out to be taller than people think. I'll introduce Brian in a minute, but before I do, just a couple of housekeeping matters. Our next Politics in the Pub is 23rd of May, which is Lynn White from Animals Australia talking about live exports, and there's a flyer on your seat about that. And then on the 27th of June, we've got Father Frank Brennan talking about refugee policy. And also, you might have seen these floating around tonight. Mandatory detention, 20 years of shame, public forum, Wednesday 9th of May at the Copland Lecture Theatre. So if you're interested in that, there's the details, and Serena will pass around a clipboard. If we haven't got your email address, the only real way to tell you what's coming up is to do it through those means. So thank you for coming along. Brian, I'll introduce now, then we'll have some Q&A, and then if you want to stick around and have a drink afterwards, then that's great too. So our guest tonight is former Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, Professor Brian Howe, who is currently chairing an independent inquiry into insecure work. The inquiry was commissioned by the ACTU to investigate the extent of insecure work and its impact on workers, their families and the community. The inquiry's received more than 500 submissions, which I think is phenomenal. So Brian spoke today at the Press Club, where I heard him speak. So I hope that you enjoy what he's got to say tonight. And even if you heard it at the Press Club, I'm sure you'll be keen to hear more. Brian was Deputy Prime Minister between 1991 and 1995. He was a Member of Parliament for the seat of Batman from 1977 to 1996, and a Minister between 83 and 96, 13 years as a Minister. His portfolios included social security, health, housing, community services, and as he said today, in talking about insecure work, we really need to think a lot more broadly than what the Fair Work Act says, and think about all those broad issues. So please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Howe.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I don't want to exactly repeat what I said earlier in the day, so I might be a little bit more perhaps biographical and gradually sort of ease my way into the topic. I've got plenty of time, so I'll try not to go on too long either, because I think probably this is quite a complex issue. It's not just about a slogan, it's about a kind of fundamental change really in the nature of work in Australian society, which is part of a complex of changes, not just that work is changing, not just that the economy is changing, the society is also coincidentally changing, and of course that means you get all these interactions that are crucially important in terms of the modern workforce. Now, just a couple of things about the inquiry. The inquiry was established last year by the ACTU, in the sense that they invited 4 people. Paul Munro, who's a senior, I think, presidential member of the Industrial Relations Commission. Sarah Charlesworth is an academic at the University of South Australia, was at RMIT with the at RMIT for a long time, but she's now at South Australia. And Jill Biddington and myself. I suppose one of the questions we could have been asked, didn't get too many questions on the actual substance of what we're talking about, but one of the questions might be, well, in what sense is the inquiry independent when it's reporting to the ACTU? And I suppose that relies on the integrity of the people that form the panel, but also it reflects the fact that Jed, the president of the ACTU, at a press club speech last year, reported on a census that the ACTU had done, looking at really the membership and the attitude of people to unions. And I think Jed brings a perspective that says, well, the trade union movement can't be insular any longer. It's got to see what it's doing as part of the larger society. It's got to become more engaged, perhaps more information, perhaps even more research-based. You know, I remember that a very long time ago I set up something in Melbourne called the Labour Resource Centre, which was a kind of small think tank that probably one of the first things of that kind. There was something a bit similar in Sydney, I remember, but there was not much, you know, and we had a launch, and Gough did the big launch for this little think tank, and a friend of mine came round later in the evening, and he presented with me with a set of 3 books he'd bought that day. And there was just a marker in one of the 3 books. They were a history of the British Labour Party in the 1920s and 30s, but the marker was on the page that showed the research division that was created in the 1920s. Now, in a sense, the Labour Party and the trade union movement have not been as strong in terms of research methods and in terms of taking a more investigatory approach, apart from I'm saying that not just in the not necessarily just as a means of organisation, but as a means of generating ideas, because at certain points the world changes in fundamental ways, and you need to be able to bring a different response. I remember Gordon Brown, when he was in opposition in Britain, published a book called Values, Visions and Voices. And I got a copy of this book and read the foreword, which was a very long foreword that was written by Gordon Brown. The book had several authors, and it had really a whole lot of quotation, really showing that there were values that went back to the medieval period. You know, it was really about trying to give a sense that the labour movement was part of a longer tradition. But in the introduction, Brown made the point that you constantly had to reframe your approach to deal with different situations. And I think, in a sense, my sort of main message that I'm really trying to get across today and tonight is, in a way, we shouldn't underestimate how much the world has changed in the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, these changes that everyone said, well, these are very good changes, and we're moving to a... sorry, just slipped down. These changes, so-called reforms that occurred, you know, in a sense, they were part of a broader set of changes, and quite fundamental in many ways. And Australia becomes this different place. And in a sense, we haven't always responded to that. We've kind of responded incrementally rather than trying to analyse, well, what's really going on? What's really happened in that particular period? So I think the ACTU basically wanted to ask itself some questions. You know, the nature of work has clearly changed, and what does that mean? And what are the drivers? What's really making that change happen? What are the implications of the change in terms of the financial outcomes? What are the implications in terms of occupational health and safety? What are the implications in terms of families? What are the implications for communities and so on? You know, sort of a much more a kind of interrogatory kind of approach. And so to have a panel that kind of led the discussion wasn't the ACTU was quite important. And we went to 24 different centres around Australia, from Darwin to Perth and from Gosford to Ballarat and so on, trying to run through towns. But we basically tried to cover a fair bit of Australia in the sense of recognising it was important. Now that's again important, you know, to be getting out and engaging with people, not because you want to offer them something or persuade them or something, but because you want to hear what they've got to say and what they think about the changes that are occurring. I suppose on the kind of biographical point, I just go back to 1996 and leaving government in 1996, it was a bit difficult. I had to spend a day on the phone dealing with telecom, which was extremely annoying. I hadn't used a phone for years. But I suppose what I tended to think, well, gee, maybe we didn't do a pretty bloody good job, really, in many ways, I felt, well, and I ought to write something, I thought, write something down about what a good job I'd done, really. And people ought to know what a good job it was, because not everyone was telling me this. So I actually had the good fortune to go to Princeton for the best part of 2 years, and to actually sit in the library and actually read and think. And I read Castell's Network Society. I think was probably the most important book I read. It was just really coming out at that time, the 3 volumes, a fantastic book. And basically it was describing really how the world had changed, and described how the world had changed and what was driving change, particularly global finance, particularly the rapid change in technology, the revolution in terms of communications, shrinking of the world, the sense of time and place change. Time and place are not what they used to be. People are working very different patterns of hours, and so when you think about the working life, it's no longer the same working day and working week and working month, and the conditions associated with work are changing, and in a sense all the verities are going. And I think Castells is extremely good at distilling that and showing what the implications of this very different global kind of movement that obviously so strong in the United States, but you can see the same kind of effect. I'm thinking to myself, well, we were not responding to all of that. I mean, in a sense, political economy was something you associate with the 1970s, and yet this is political economy working itself out, a new political economy, a political economy that's built around risk. Now, I use the word risk because I like to refer to I like to refer to Paul Kelly, because his classical end of certainty, as it were, was the great justification in a sense of a party that lost its values and had sold out to international capitalism, and what a good thing that was. And so I like to think of the end of certainty as the onset of risk, because there's a sense in which there are new risks that emerge. As much as I think Australia did have to have a very different strategy, and it did need to be an international strategy, I think it was always questionable the extent to which, even in the 1930s, the Australia book, referred to that sort of sense of being insular and being frightened of the world, Renew the frightened country. In a sense, we were not prepared to sometimes use our values in an international sense, but to hide behind protective walls and hide behind a situation which in many ways had enormous contradictions built into it. And so, when I thought about all this, I thought, well, we need to be rethinking what's happening. The other book that I read that was to me a very important book was a book by Ulrich Beck called The Risk Society. And why The Risk Society was an important book, I think, alongside the onset of economic risk and so on. The Risk Society was important because I think I was persuaded very much by Beck's argument that in a sense the customary values that underlie so much of human behaviour are now under such critical question. And so much that was taken for granted in the post-war period. Remember, very conventional kind of households and pattern of living in post-war Australia. In a sense, a lot of that taken for granted assumptions, in a sense, needed to be questioned, because you were not going to be able to have a fulfilment of the women's liberation and the gender revolution that really begins in the 1960s and 70s without recognising that would have a fundamental impact on contracts within families and households and communities, so on. So we're not talking about when we're talking about change, we're not just talking about economic change. We've got to talk about economic and social change interacting. And of course you could also argue that environmentally, in a way, there are huge influences too that mean our sense of what time means also changes in that longer sense. You know, that when we talk about equality, we need to be talking much more about equality across generations and not thinking about equality at a certain point in time, because and when we know, well, you know that argument. I don't want to spell that out. So to come back to today's event that was really part of this broader picture that I'm painting, and that was really about insecure work. Now the ACTU have broadened the definition, if you like, of insecure work, so it's roughly, they say, 40% of the workforce. But we know that a very large part of the workforce are really a very large part of the workforce are living, are working in very different ways than they may have done in the post-war period. So, and what people talk about is really standard work and the standard kind of model, and the movement towards non-standard work, or if you like, a much greater variation in the contracts that exist and the form of contracts that exist that govern the conditions under which people work. So in a sense, whereas we were comfortable enough in the post-war period with more of a homogeneous model, once you recognise the fundamental contradiction in terms of gender, then you have to think in terms of a very different model. The male breadwinner's state is gone, and you need to replace it with something which is more gender enhancing or neutral, or however you express that thought. So the ACTU are interested really, I suppose, primarily in work, but they are interested also in these broader relationships, and that's what I think Jed's been getting across, the need to not think that what we can do is fix up work as if that's separate from everything else, but see work as part of this process of modernisation that is going on, this very different society that's emerging. Now, when I thought and worked on this issue, I was very much influenced by a German social scientist, his name was Gunter Schmidt, who wrote about what he called labour market transitions, or transitions across the life course. And Schmidt was quite important because Schmidt, to me, very important in Europe, because in a way he's been one of the most influential people in redefining a lot of these issues in Europe. But Schmidt was important because, remember, in Australia we became very preoccupied in the 80s and perhaps even the 90s with the so-called welfare to work thing. You know, that people had this difficulty moving off welfare into work, and you know, depending on which side of politics you're on, you were more or less censorious about people's inability to work themselves off benefits into a job. Now, in a way, what Schmidt says was, look, that clearly is one of the transitions from unemployment to employment, but there are many other transitions across the life course. For example, for women have rather a different life course pattern than men because of childbearing responsibilities and caring responsibilities, which, notwithstanding our great commitment to equities, continue to be somewhat unbalanced. So women have to be able to leave the workforce and come back into the workforce, and those transitions out and in, and what happens while that person is in transition, you know, whether she's simply child caring or whether she's doing some other things as well that are going to help to enhance, and the terms and conditions on which you leave and don't leave. And it's not just all fixed by parental leave. I mean, there's a much more complex issue about the attitudes of employers to that person who's gone off to do something that, in economic terms, they would give very little value to, whereas in human terms we would give the highest value. And that's one of the contradictions that we've got going on here. There's a kind of paid, unpaid work thing, you know, that the only work that's really worth counting is the work that's paid, whereas work that's unpaid isn't kind of recognised in GDP, isn't recognised as being part of the important stuff that's going on. So Schmidt talks about all these transitions. You know, the person that's involved in the ladder accident at home and suffers a serious back injury, are not covered by workers' compensation or anything like that, but probably are not going to be able to work again perhaps for quite a long time. And that's a very difficult transition for that person to come to terms with the fact that he or she does have a disability, and that they have to be able to manage that disability, and they have to maybe move out of the occupation they're in and move towards another occupation. Or the person who's in employment but is downgraded in the job. They think they've got a terrific job, it's secure, they think they're on the way up, and then suddenly they find zoom. They go down 3 steps and they don't know really whether they can manage, because we've encouraged people to take these incredible mortgages, and those mortgages depend on a continuity of income for both him and her. And she's got a part-time job, but it's a part-time casual job, and she wants to convert that to a permanent job, and in the shop assistance enterprise agreement or whatever, she's supposed to be able to do that. But the boss will never come round to actually agreeing to that. He'll never come around to say, well, yeah, sure, Alice, we should put you on permanent because I know you've got that sick husband at home, and I know it's important for you to have control of your hours. So in a way, when you think about this issue, what it's about is people who, for whatever reason, in terms of the old system, seem to have some control over their working life. In this new situation, they have less and less control over their working life. They're less and less, I don't want to talk about worker sovereignty, that would be far too radical, but in a sense that's the issue. The issue of whether the person is entitled to say, well, I can't come in today, or whether when the person says that, particularly the casual worker, he gets the bullet or she gets the bullet next week. And in the example I mentioned today of the hospital orderly in Western Australia at the Perth Hospital, if you can't make it, well, you're through. There are new real harshness about the working environment that, in a way, people just don't know about, because for the most part we don't have a direct experience. So that's why all these submissions are important, and people turning up and telling anecdotes. There's a terrific guy up in Darwin who he looked like a welder or a fitter or something. He looked he's obviously worked in the construction industry, and he sort of looked extremely burly, and my name's Bill Gilbert, and I've got a background in the construction industry. I'm doing a PhD at the university. Now, I've got a Marxist interpretation, he says. But his knowledge of how, because he reflected on what was happening and what the work practices were, was just fantastic. So all these stories, in a sense, add up to a very different situation. When people say what's happening in politics, in a way what's happening is under the radar. Under the radar, there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there about the terms and conditions associated with employment, or what the ACTU calls insecure work. I suppose that's the core of really what I want to say. I can say a few other things, but in a way, that's the kind of message I'm trying to get across is that the world of work has changed very dramatically. But it's changed very dramatically at a time that relationships are changing, and also we're developing rather different values about sustainability and so on. There's a complex set of changes. And while this is all happening, the politicians want to talk about stuff that's what they call politics, whereas what people are concerned about is what's the impact of a changing economic and social environment on them, and why don't the politicians understand what's happening? And I think that Jed's initiative is important because it's showing that the ACTU wants to understand what's happening, so that we can begin to address those issues. So I won't say any more about the drivers, but I might say a few things about consequences. I think the drivers I see very much about the issues I've mentioned: globalisation, financial, technological, communication, all those sorts of things. That the nature of capitalism is changing, and the power of finance capitalism has been enormous. And in a way, one of the problems in politics is people don't make distinctions, that they don't recognise that capital is not just one great globule, but capital divides into all sorts of fractions. I mean, if we ever had a lesson about that, well, we've got it today in the paper, really, about the mining tax and even divisions within the mining industry. But the divisions between different fractions of capital is very important. And in a sense, that all kind of links into, historically in the post-war period, manufacturing capital, particularly in the southeastern states, was so important. And behind that all, there was a kind of patronising, but nevertheless a sense of collective responsibility that doesn't exist in terms of modern capitalism. And of course, we're not interested in analysing political economy the way we were in the 1970s, and so I don't think we put enough emphasis on the options that might exist if we actually analyse what's happening to capitalism. Now I go on to, I think the main consequence of what I've been describing is what I call individuation. That is, people are being increasingly isolated in a sense. So the experience of the casual person in the firm is that they're not recognised as a person, really. They're not. It's like labour hire. Labour hire works. If you're working at, you might be doing some work at David Jones, and you're working with staff at David Jones, and it's like as if they're your fellow employees, but actually you're not employed by David Jones, you're employed by a hire company to clean David Jones, and in a sense none of those relationships can be significant. You're in an isolated situation. And if you have an occupational health and safety accident, there are real questions about who's really responsible for that, because who is your employer becomes an important question. But more generally, there is this sense of people in a modern workplace being individuals. Now, for a lot of us, that's terrific. I mean, that is absolutely terrific, isn't it? Because I imagine for many people in this room, that's exactly what they are. They might work for government one day. If they get a decent contract, they might go and do that somewhere else down in Sydney. Might be a contract in New York. They can whip off to New York. They have skills that they are well established. They're able to replenish them. They're not people that stop doing education in matric or in the university. They're lifelong learners. They're constantly keeping up to date with their field. They remain expert in their field. They're able to be mobile consultants. Kind of the concept of mobility is absolutely no problem. And in a sense, they form part of what I call the core workforce. And the core workforce are people with this considerable investment in them, often working more individually, less collectively than they would have in the post-war period. But nevertheless, when you talk about choosing, they can choose. They can make a choice. And we talk about this peripheral group that I've been describing, the group in the casual workforce, the people who are not the part-time permanents necessarily, but the part-time casuals, the people that don't know whether the contract will be renewed next week or next month, people working in TAFE that have got short-term contracts at ANU and so on. Increasingly, you've got a whole stack of people out there. Some of those people, sure, they can cope with that and they can move and so on. But for people who are down the scale, not so much a blue-white collar distinction, but people who are in the contingent workforce, their choices are extremely limited. And in a sense, they struggle to establish identity in that situation. Now, the consequences of part-time and casual work obviously are about all sorts of things. They're certainly about control over your hours of work and all of that. How many hours you work. There are very large numbers of people who'd want to work more hours, who can't simply get more hours to be able to work. There are people who are employed casually, of course, are almost ruled out of getting mortgages, and so they can't even to borrow money for a car might be extremely difficult. So there are those kind of financial consequences, but there are also all the risks associated with occupational health and safety, where people haven't been trained. They're not eligible for very often for training and so on. They're not people that you invest in. not people who you think of as having a future. This is throwaway labour. This is like the stuff you throw out, when you go to get the takeaways. It's not about. So this is not about investment. This is about people who are, in a sense, being treated as commodities, and that then attacks the heart of what it means to be a good society. Now, the policy issues, of course, are many and various, and the particular one that I emphasise, I guess, particularly is the need for investment in lifelong learning and the development of perhaps learning accounts and ways to basically keep people learning across the life course so that they can cope with rapid technological change. But of course there are all sorts of other things as well. There are issues to do with housing. Now we've built a kind of housing economy, I suppose, that assumes people can afford these very large mortgages, and particularly put a lot of weight on the second earner. And if the second earner is casual rather than permanent, then there's an unpredictability about the second earner's income, and of course that then affects the capacity to continue to service a mortgage, or even to get a mortgage initially. Or maybe just one or two final points. I quoted today a statement from Mike Keating, who was head of Prime Ministers when I was in Cabinet and so on, and who's a labour market economist and then initially from Melbourne University and then Canberra and so on. And Keating said, well, on one occasion at a conference actually on transitional labour markets, he said that effectively you can't increase employment in Australia without lifting skills. He said if you're thinking about increasing aggregate employment, and in a way the Business Council and I was just reading something from the IPA about these issues, and these various groups, they say, well, the issue of productivity is being enhanced by casual work. That Australia's got a productivity problem, and the answer to the productivity problem is effectively to encourage more casual work. Now, as the Australian Institute point out very strongly in their submission, effectively casualisation means that you get a ticket not to be invested in. You get a mark on the forehead to basically say you're not someone who's got any future in this firm. Now, if that's the attitude of the company to you, then you're hardly likely to be extremely productive. If you think you're really under the hammer in that way, and what's more, you can't actually lift your hand to say what you think might make a difference, then in a sense that means that that helps to create this what I call this peripheral economy. This two-level economy, the peripheral economy, which is really a drag, if you like, rather than helping to create productivity. Probably that's overstating it, but I'm really just trying to make a point. And I think we have to do much better in terms of the way we think about education, the way we think about the future of Australia, and how we kind of build the skills of the nation. Perhaps one other final point. Gunter Schmidt, who I'm impressed by and like, talks about what he calls employment insurance rather than unemployment insurance. And there's a reason for that. Why he talks about employment insurance, he says, well, we're living in this world now which is much more risky than it's been before. And if you're thinking about social policy, you need to anticipate risk. And I remember going to a conference in Berlin, the World Bank conference, to talk about social policy, and someone was making the point that you need to have two things. You need to have a safety net for when things break down, but you need more than that, a strategy to be able to anticipate and manage risk. And I think for the ACTU and for people interested in the social future of Australia, we are going to go into a very difficult period. Paul Munro, who's the one of the principal people in our panel, takes an extremely pessimistic view of Australia's future in this region. Things are going to be very tough, and they're going to be very high risks. And so we need to be thinking about how to manage those risks. And the ACTU, I think, by setting up this inquiry, is trying to get people thinking more than anything else. And if we can get people thinking, well, solutions hopefully will emerge from the Australia Institute and other think tanks around Australia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brian. We've got a bit of time for some questions. I'll ask the first one. It's Youth Week this week. I don't know if everyone knew that. But young people are disproportionately represented in the ranks of the unemployed, and they're disproportionately represented in the ranks of the casually employed. How through the submissions or the other evidence that's been put before you, how is the sort of the problems for young people of this labour market sort of manifest? Because it's an all new idea. 50 years ago, young people finished school and their first job was a full-time job.
Well, nowadays, of course, they don't finish school. They start working while they're at school because they're expensive, and work through the university. Not always, apparently, and they work through the university. I think one of the issues is, I think the fact that a lot of younger people are working much more than they should be at the stage that they're at. I mean, they should be, in fact, focusing on building their knowledge base and their skills, but effectively they're focused very much on survival. And of course, the other problem basically is employers are again not interested in the development of young people. It may well be, we have this debate that goes on about whether bad jobs lead to good jobs. Well, bad jobs might lead to good jobs if employers were sensitive enough to identify opportunities where people could kind of move on, could build new skills. But in a way, I think the Brotherhood in their submission put a lot of emphasis on building capability. It's not just about teaching a competence. I think Laurie Carmichael, may not have been quite right in his big review of vocational education. I think he put far too much emphasis on particular competences and not enough on problem solving and developmental capabilities. And for young people, the really important thing is not what they do tomorrow, but what they'll be able to do in the future. And they have, therefore, to be treated favourably. And if they're exploited by their parents or exploited by employers in a way that's not directed at their welfare, that's a problem.
I'd like to talk about the other end of the spectrum. Global financial crisis means that a lot of older workers, people in their 60s who might have looked forward to retirement, are forced to continue to work. And of course there are some people who feel that they want to continue to work. What's the attitude towards that in this report of concerning older workers?
Well, of course, this report today actually conceded, or this the press club thing coincided with Wayne Swan responding to a report that I worked on last year on ageing. And in that report, which is on the economic participation of older Australians, we were looking to, I think probably the main message in that report was that that the whole process of ageing has shifted. People are living much longer, they're living well much longer, but if you think back to what I was saying about learning, we've front-loaded education and we've thought, well, basically you can get people on the track and they'll stay on that track. Not so. In a way, the modern labour market means you've got to keep working on it. And of course, people need to be given options. Older people don't need to think, oh yes, the future is I have to doing that job. They could be doing all sorts of other things. And in a way, it doesn't much matter whether they're in the paid workforce or not. It does matter, of course, that they're making a contribution in some area in the community. And so, in a sense, we need to reframe that. So, in a way, it's the transition has changed as part of a life course change. and that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be primarily addressed, in my view, by continuing to invest in people, but also encouraging people to plan for their retirement. People often don't think about, and well, the R word's a pretty problematic word anyway. I don't take it too seriously myself. But you know, I think planning for your retirement these days is probably more planning for a life course transition. That means you want to live life as well as you can at a certain stage, and that of course is a combination of health but education's a big factor, but also other incentives and things. The government's introduced some incentives today. I think I'm not sure they'll make a huge difference, but they've done some things. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk, and I think it's amazing that there's work being done on rethinking what's happening in the labour market. I mean, at the moment you've sort of got the Labour Party talking about the sort of security of jobs, and it doesn't seem like they're really talking about anything that people relate to. And the Liberal Party talking about flexibility and productivity in a way that seems to be against the interests of working people. In terms of the Fair Work Act review and the submissions that business gave to the Fair Work Act review, talking about flexibility and productivity, it looks like we're going to have a reopening of the debate about the legislation that governs working rights in Australia. What do you think this type of rethinking between trying to find a middle ground about security, flexibility, risk, society, all those ideas, what role can we play in that debate? What role can unions play in that debate? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a matter of deepening the debate. I think there are some things that were recommended could be done, although I think we'll be thinking a bit beyond. Well, we don't want to think just in terms of regulation anyway, but for example, people who are indefinitely employed casually, that seems to be pretty outrageous. You know, if you've been employed for 15 years in TAFE or somewhere as a casual employer and you miss out, on something like 3 or 4 months of the year because you're a casual as opposed to, a permanent employee, well, that seems to be. So there are some things like that certainly can be addressed, and you can certainly look at the 10 labour standards and so on, and you can debate that. But the more fundamental issue is really that work has changed, and we need to have a more comprehensive response.
Fly-in, fly-out workers are being used more in the mining industry.
Yeah,
I was just
sure.
wondering whether you had anything to say about the increasing use of that kind of labour.
Well, I suppose that's the classical one where you separate work and family. You say, well,
Do you mind me trying to repeat that question? I might not have heard it.
okay, the question's really about fly-in and fly-out workers, and to what extent this is a reflection of insecure work or casualisation, whatever. I think the fly-in, fly-out issue is there are several levels. I mean, at Wollongong recently, in our inquiry, Wollongong steel industry was dramatically closed or cut back. A lot of people lost their jobs. They'll be going to mainly Bowen Basin in Queensland, but their families will remain in Wollongong. In Western Australia, of course, most fly-in, fly-out workers live in Perth, and of course they make a very substantial contribution to the economy in Perth, but at the same time we know that people who are living in the mining towns across Western Australia are for the most part doing it pretty hard, and so it's a very difficult issue. We also know that fly-in, fly-out is taking a lot of people out of the core workforce, if you like, in manufacturing. So it has impacts back on so-called skill shortages within the metropolitan area. I was asked this question today, and I got a bit romantic, I suppose, because I thought that we keep in Australia, the rush that never ended and all that. We just keep proceeding incrementally, rather than being able to stand back and work out how we plan to use our mineral wealth in the most effective way. And I think in the 1970s, at least, I think early 80s, there was a considerable debate about whether we were just pushing our minerals offshore at whatever price we could get for them, as opposed to achieving the maximum benefit of that wealth. Now, achieving the maximum benefit is about various things. It's certainly about sort of onshore processing and doing more with metals and goods in Australia than just simply shipping the stuff out. But it's also certainly about that. But it's also about the quality of life issues, and we separate. I mean, Twiggy, what's his name? Forrest said today, well, it costs us $100,000 to send to set anyone up there, and subsidy presumably. And we know the cost of housing is so high, and it's just not something that can be resolved without a lot of thought. And then, of course, the Australia Institute would say that the benefits of the far too rapid growth of the mining industry are really being largely dissipated in repatriation of profits and so on, rather than being part of a national development strategy. And in today's paper there's really a kind of indirect discussion of that issue.
I like the idea, Brian, that onshore processing, it's good for mining and it's good for refugees perhaps as well. Sorry, question up here and then I'll come up there.
You mentioned the ageing population, and there's a huge scarcity of human resources. Can you please comment on 4 points? One is the 50 plus age group are now being given an incentive for employers to employ people aged over 50 by paying them $1,000 each. Please note that people with disabilities lose their jobs if they take a day's sick leave, they get sacked, and there's a huge broad spectrum of disability. 10,000 Indian workers are going to be brought into work apparently. How come they're given employment whereas refugees and asylum seekers are not given equal employment opportunities? And you mentioned about training. We seem to be reneging on our training arrangements, and that seems to be having a huge impact. So how do you fit all this into...
I don't know. That's a complex question. I don't think I can. I mean, I can certainly focus on the last one, which is the fact that we just need to make it a much higher priority. And that was Mike Keating's point. And of course, when we proceed incrementally, what happens is we make these compromises, and perhaps they don't work at either end effectively on short-term visas and so on. I mean, we had these very fundamental changes. I think one of why we need to have research and reflection. There's a time which Australia stood out in terms of the way we treated people. People came to the country and they got access to the whole range of benefits very, very quickly. There's a very, very big cultural change over the last 20 years, and in a way we need to, we may say something about this in our report, but I do think we need to have a more fundamental discussion about migration in Australia than what we've had. I think the Tony Burke paper was, to say the least, extremely disappointing because he just didn't face the fundamental questions. Not that I don't think we can't have a larger population, but I think we do have to know how we're going to manage that, and he didn't address that issue really. Just leave it to the market.
I wonder if you could expand a little on the concept of employment insurance that you mentioned, and whether it relates at all to government subsidies for job creation or sustenance.
Yeah, I might well do that. I think it's more a kind of mindset that I'm trying to express there, a sense that of building a strategy that anticipates risk. Now let's take the National Disability Insurance Scheme that the government is currently moving towards implementing. The reason that scheme has won favour in government is that Bruce Bonyhady and the main people involved in promoting that scheme have really persuaded the government and persuaded Treasury that to not do something like that would be catastrophic. It would result in endless suffering for families and for people with serious disability. We just are not putting enough money into the care of people with disabilities to be able to give them decent levels of care. So we need not just a minor change, but a fundamental change. Now, what I'm talking about employment is a bit the same. That in a sense we've sort of struggled along with unemployment benefit and youth allowance and New Start and welfare to work and trying to drag more money out of very limited dollars. But no one has said fundamentally we need a different system, a different approach. And I think that's what we do need. We need a different approach that anticipates the risk. And the risks are not just of unemployment. They're risks of underemployment. We've got this crazy definition of what is an hour a week or whatever. So in a sense, underemployment is as big a risk as unemployment. And it's got a huge cost associated with it. Now we are not anticipating, not taking that seriously. We stick with the the 5 point whatever it is, as if that's the end of the story, where it's really only the beginning of the story. And so what employment insurance is about is about how to manage the transition between various forms of work, whether it's unpaid or paid work. Whether it's from unemployment to employment, whether it's from education to back into work, whether it's from caring responsibilities into work, or whether it's from work into caring responsibilities. In a sense, we need to be thinking about not the simple transition that dominated discussion in the welfare to work debate, but all of those transitions which are occasioned by an approach to work and to the economy which has much more risk burden built into it. And that's what, in a sense, I think we've done in the 1980s and 90s. We've created, we're much more exposed in a way to risk, and of course the people who bear that risk are the people who are the most, or a large share of that risk are the people who are the most disadvantaged. So employment insurance says that issue exists and it needs to be addressed. And if Gunter Schwendt were here, he would say, look, in Europe there are a number of different models you can think about. But we need to put our thinking caps on and come up with models that we think, like with national disability insurance. I mean, that's a model that will, I think, work and make a huge difference, as big as Medicare in many ways. But we need to be thinking like that because we are more exposed to risk than we were in the days when we had the so-called wage earners welfare state.
Look, we've just about run out of time in terms of that point Brian was just making. So if you work for more than 1 hour a week, you're employed. According to the ABS, who are well represented here today. G'day, Paul. They're here listening.
Oh no!
And,
how have I insulted?
And look, for those who understand what the measures mean, they're useful, but the implications are quite different. But you consider the following: if you had 10,000 full-time jobs, and you divided them up into 1 hour jobs rather than 40-hour jobs, you could create 400,000 jobs. If you wanted to take 400,000 people out of the official unemployment stats, then you could create 10,000 full-time jobs and just spread them ridiculously thinly. Now, luckily no one's proposed that in Australia, but if you look around, a lot of it's happened. An enormous amount of full-time jobs have been repackaged as small occasional jobs. And to the extent that people are happy to work 10 hours a week and that suits their life, that's great. But to the extent they're underemployed, then that's just as much a social problem as being in that official state of unemployment, which was actually a very long way of saying I don't think there's a more overemployed retired politician than Brian, who, if you think about what he said tonight, he's ticked off, he's doing the ACTU inquiry into flexible work. He's clearly a flexible kind of guy, if not an insecure guy. We've got the inquiry into cities and the inquiry into ageing. So in the last 12 months, Brian's been at the heart of 3 of the, I think, bigger challenges facing us. And amongst all that, he's found time to come and talk to us tonight. So please join me in thanking Professor.